All right, let's bring on Steve O'Loughlin. I see him here backstage. He's the CFO. There he is of Actinium Pharmaceuticals. Steve, how's your day going so far?
Doing great, thank you. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. I see we have your slides, guys. Let's bring them up on the screen. There they are. Steve, the floor is yours, sir. Tell us all about Actinium.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Before I begin presentation of Actinium, just want to cover a disclaimer and safe harbor as maybe making forward-looking statements. I would encourage everyone to reference our SEC filings. Actinium is focused on developing targeted radiotherapies for patients with unmet needs. Radiotherapy is used today to treat over 50% of patients with cancer. It's been used for over a century in medicine, and it's arguably one of our best weapons against cancer. However, it's delivered primarily from outside of the body, leading to toxicity, side effects to normal healthy organs and beyond its intended cancer targets. Actinium is deploying technology known as antibody radiation conjugates. We have a late stage pipeline led by our pivotal phase 3 program, IMAB-B, where we just recently this month announced completion of the phase 3 Sierra trial. We're very much looking forward to providing a data update from the Sierra trial in the fourth quarter of this year, leading up to top line data from the trial in the middle of next year, 2022. We've evolved IMAB to go beyond just bone marrow transplant conditioning to move into areas of adoptive cell therapy like CAR-T and gene therapy, where we see a very large market opportunity emerging, and we intend to use IMAB as a universal conditioning solution. In addition to our IMAB targeted conditioning program, we also have our Actimab-A, which is a CD33 targeting antibody with the alpha-emitting isotope actinium-225. We have ongoing combination trials, one with a salvage chemotherapy regimen called CLAG-M and the other with a targeted regimen called Venetoclax. We have presented proof of concept from both of those trials, which we believe is very compelling, and I'll highlight those in subsequent slides. And in addition to that, and underpinning our clinical programs, we have our technology platform. And this really encompasses our significant experience with targeted radiotherapies. We have treated several hundred patients. We have a supply chain that can bring these therapies to some of the leading comprehensive cancer centers in the United States. We have extensive know-how and IP with over 160 patents. We have a research collaboration with Astellas Pharma, a top 20 global biopharmaceutical company that we're very excited about, as well as an NIH-funded clinical collaboration with Memorial Sloan Kettering in the field of CAR-T that I will also highlight. We have a strong balance sheet with over $82 million in cash at the end of the second quarter of this year, which provides us significant runway through multiple milestones from our clinical trials, as well as our technology platform. So just a quick snapshot of the pipeline. You see at the top there, led by IMAB-B and the fully enrolled phase 3 Sierra trial, with multiple milestones expected from that phase 3 trial over the coming quarters. And as I mentioned, we've built out beyond just transplant to focus on CAR-T and gene therapy. And then with our Actimab-A programs, we believe that we're developing a potential backbone therapy for AML, which continues to have significant unmet needs. So to talk about targeted radiotherapy and what it encompasses, we take antibodies, which are able to seek out cancer cells based on markers expressed on the surface, and we connect them with radioisotopes, which through energy are able to kill cells. As I mentioned, radiation is used extensively in the treatment of cancer. It's been used for over a century. It's a validated modality. However, it's restricted in its applications given the delivery from outside the body. We believe by delivering it at the cellular level, we can bring efficacy to cancer indications that are not adequately addressed by current modalities such as chemotherapy or even some of the newer targeted therapies or immunotherapy. We're applying our targeted radiotherapies to targeted conditioning to enable bone marrow transplant and other cellular therapies. We have ongoing therapeutic combination trials, as I highlighted with Actimab A. And we've recently announced our intention to move into solid tumors, which opens up very large potential indications, as well as next generation ARCs, including combination therapies. Actinium has emerged as not just a clinical stage company. We've really enhanced our R&D facilities and capabilities. We've built out our own laboratory space, which we're now using to execute not only our research collaboration with Astellas, but also our own internal R&D efforts. And we look forward to providing updates on that before the end of the year. So with Actimab, our lead program being a targeted conditioning agent, I think it's important to articulate why conditioning matters. So currently, if a patient is in need of a bone marrow transplant or CAR T or even gene therapy, in many instances, majority of instances, they need to be conditioned. And what this means is they need to be prepared, essentially removing cancer cells and immune cells to enable the transplanted cells to engraft and do their intended purpose once they're administered to the patient. Now, the way that conditioning is done today is a combination of chemotherapies and external radiation. These are non-targeted approaches that we believe restricts patient access to potentially curative treatment options. They're associated with acute and chronic toxicities, as well as a risk of mortality, or even just a failure to condition the patient adequately to move on. So I will talk on the next several slides about bone marrow transplant in the context of Actimab B and the Sierra trial. And if we just think about transplant, the way that the field has looked at this is there's myeloablative conditioning, which is more intensive. And while it can put patients into a remission and prepare them for transplant, it's associated with higher rates of mortality. Reduced intensity conditioning was developed to provide a less intensive alternative. However, the trade-off being there's potentially higher rates of relapse. And as I'll show on a subsequent slide, outcomes are essentially the same, and they're both very poor in our opinion and need to be improved upon. Now, thinking about, what is the potential opportunity here, there's about 175,000 patients diagnosed each year with cancers that are potentially treatable with a bone marrow transplant. These are primarily blood cancers. Yet only 23,000 patients or so actually went on to transplant. So that's a significant number of patients that could potentially benefit from a transplant. And we're looking to enable that and improve access and outcomes with Actimab B. So more specifically about what Actimab B actually is, it's a CD45 targeting antibody known as apamistamab, conjugated with the radioisotope iodine-131. And CD45 is a unique target. We think it's the perfect target for what we're applying it for, as it's expressed on blood cancer cells, leukemia and lymphoma cells. It's expressed on immune cells, including bone marrow stem cells, but it's not really expressed outside of the hematopoietic or blood-forming system. It's expressed high copies, but it does not internalize. So we believe that lends itself to a radio conjugate as opposed to like an antibody drug conjugate or even just a regular antibody, because we're able to kill from outside the cell, leveraging the energy released from the isotope. And at high levels of iodine-131, we're applying it for bone marrow transplant for myeloablation, that's Actimab B, and at lower levels for gene therapy and CAR T, known as Actimab ACT. We licensed Actimab B from the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, a pioneer in the field of bone marrow transplant. They've received the Nobel Prize for their work in the field. And before we licensed Actimab, it was studied in about 300 patients, studied in multiple clinical trials in multiple blood cancers. And there was a uniform profile that came from these trials in that Actimab B was able to get these patients to transplant. They were able to engraft and had improved outcomes. So if we just look at transplant for AML, acute myeloid leukemia, which is our first indication, if a patient gets salvage chemotherapy or chemotherapy in a bone marrow transplant, which is essentially standard of care today, the outcomes are the same, and we believe they're very poor, with 1 year survival of about 10% and virtually no survival at 2 years. In a previous trial done at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, patients who received Imab-B and a transplant had 1 year overall survival rates of 30%, so a threefold difference over current approaches. And at 2 years, nearly 20% of patients were still alive. And if you look at this study and you look at the survival curves, patients alive and disease-free 2 years after their transplant went on to live many years thereafter. In many cases, we had survival out over 5 years. So taking that data from the Hutch, we went and met with the FDA and designed the pivotal phase 3 trial, Sierra, which is now fully enrolled. It's a 150 patient study. Patients randomized 1-to-1 to receive either Imab and a transplant or physician's choice of salvage therapy. The salvage therapy could include up to 20 agents, including some of the recently approved agents in the field of AML, such as Venetoclax, FLT3 inhibitors, IDH1 and IDH2 inhibitors. And the primary endpoint of this study is 6 months durable complete remission with secondary endpoint of overall survival. Now, in patients who receive physician's choice of salvage therapy and are unable to achieve a remission and go on to a transplant, there is a crossover component whereby patients can still receive Imab-B and then potentially go on for their transplant. We're very proud of the centers who participated in the Sierra trial, 24 centers in the United States and Canada, including many of the leading bone marrow transplant centers in the country, if not the world, MD Anderson, Mayo Clinic, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and many, many other top bone marrow transplant centers. So we've presented data at medical conferences highlighting rates of bone marrow transplant, engraftment, as well as some safety data through 75% of patient enrollment. That is detailed here on this slide. And if you look at the middle column with the headline BMT engraftment, you can see that of the patients who received the therapeutic dose of Imab-B, 100% of those patients were able to access a transplant and engrafted without delay. If you contrast that to the bottom box in that column, patients who received salvage therapy in the control arm, only 18% of patients were able to achieve a remission and go on to transplant. That left 82% of patients who are failures for the primary endpoint. And of those 47 patients, 30 were able to cross over and receive Imab-B, and 30 of those 30 patients, 100%, were also able to access a transplant and engrafted without delay. Now, we were able to look at patients out 100 days to look at patients who had a non-relapse transplant-related mortality. And in the patients receiving Imab-B, only 4%, compared to patients on the control arm of 20%. That left a nearly 5x difference in the number of patients potentially evaluable for the primary endpoint of 6-month durable complete remission, with 43 patients in the Imab arm compared to 8 patients in the control arm. To get approval, we have to show a 2x difference in the rate of DCR. And as I said, at this point, at this data evaluation, there was potentially greater than 5x. So with the Sierra trial enrollment complete, we expect to provide interim data update in the 4th quarter of this year. That will entail BMT access, engraftment, 100-day transplant-related mortality data, like I just showed you on the prior slide, and then leading up to the top-line data in the middle of 2022 next year. We believe Imab has a highly differentiated position in AML, especially for relapse refractory patients where a bone marrow transplant is the only potentially curative treatment option. And despite 9 drug approvals in AML since 2017 for the relapse refractory patient population that we're targeting with Sierra, outcomes have not been materially changed. So for the patients with Iomab who could potentially benefit from Iomab, we believe this is a paradigm shift that can increase access to transplant, giving patients a chance to receive a potentially curative bone marrow transplant with a very targeted therapy, and allow them to potentially have improved outcomes. Now, I mentioned that we've evolved to go beyond just bone marrow transplant conditioning with inroads into CAR T and gene therapy. We're very excited about our CAR T clinical collaboration with Memorial Sloan Kettering, which has been awarded NIH grant funding. So here we're working with a CAR T that Sloan Kettering has developed. They've studied it and published data in the New England Journal of Medicine in over 50 patients, showing an 83% remission rate, which is on par with the approved CAR T therapies. In this study, Iomab ACT, so a lower dose of Iomab B, will be used to condition these patients to see if we can improve outcomes. That would include both lowering rates of certain CAR T associated side effects, such as cytokine release syndrome and neurotoxicity, as well as improving patient outcomes. So we'll be looking at response rates, durability of response, and ultimately survival. And what excites us about targeted conditioning is whether it's bone marrow transplant, CAR T, or gene therapy, these procedures are performed in a very concentrated number of centers across the United States. The top 50 centers do 70% of the bone marrow transplant volume. The 24 centers that participated in Sierra did over 30% of the transplant volume. So this is a concentrated market that will not require a very large sales force. We think this is a market opportunity that we can commercialize ourselves, and we intend to in the United States. However, Europe is a potentially larger market opportunity. So are several other ex-US markets, including certain Asian markets and Latin American markets. There, we're potentially exploring partnerships to commercialize Iomab B in those territories. But given the historical data that exists from Iomab in multiple blood cancers, we see an opportunity to really expand and put in place a strong lifecycle management strategy for Iomab B and Iomab ACT across transplant, CAR T, and gene therapy conditions. Now moving on to our Actimab A program, CD33 with the Actinium-225 isotope warhead. Here we have studied this construct in nearly 150 patients as far as a phase 2 trial as a single agent, where it showed very high response rates in patients with newly diagnosed AML, as high as 69%. However, we recognized changes in the AML field with new therapies being approved and combination strategies very much emerging. So to be in line with that, we started 2 combination trials, one Actimab A plus the salvage chemotherapy CLAG-M, and the other with Actimab A and a targeted therapy Venetoclax, which targets something called BCL2. Now, beyond chemotherapy and targeted agents, we do think there's an opportunity for additional combinations, including with immunotherapy, cell therapy, and as I mentioned previously, we expect to move into solid tumors as well. So we expect to update on those efforts before the end of the year. Now, coming back to our ongoing phase 1 trials, the Actimab A CLAG-M trial, we've presented data through 3 dose cohorts. And in the most recent 3rd dose cohort, all patients, so 100%, achieved a remission, a relatively small number of patients. But when we look at the trial in totality, 10 of the 15 patients were able to achieve a remission. And of those 10, 7 or 70% were MRD negative, meaning there was no detectable disease at very, very finite levels. So we're very encouraged by this data. We expect to provide an update on the phase 1 trial before the end of the year. as well as in the near future be updating on the future pathway for this combination. We've also initiated a trial with Venetoclax, which is a BCL2 inhibitor approved in 3 blood cancer indications, including AML, which is where we're studying it. In the first dose cohort, which was with a sub-therapeutic dose of Actimab A, there was a 67% response rate, including 1 CR. And what intrigued us about this was the CR occurred in a patient who had very poor cytogenetics, including a TP53 mutation, which is associated with very, very poor outcomes in this disease setting. So we believe by introducing a targeted radiotherapy, we're able to not only achieve direct cell killing, but also there's a mechanistic synergy. And in the case with Venetoclax, we've demonstrated that targeted radiotherapy can reduce a protein MCL1, which has been shown to mediate resistance to Venetoclax. So we believe in this combination, there's both a direct synergy as well as a mechanistic synergy. And we look forward to providing updates on this trial and the dose escalation cohorts that we're currently underway on. So when we look at Actimab, we think that there's a large patient opportunity of about 10,000 patients in the relapse refractory AML setting, where Actimab, either with CLAG-M or Venetoclax or future combinations, can deliver strong results and deliver solutions for this patient population that continues to have very high unmet needs. And then finally, when we step back holistically and think about Iomab as transplant conditioning, Actimab as a therapeutic, we look at the market and we see, opportunities as a therapeutic in fit and unfit patients, conditioning for fit and unfit patients, and a concentrated market where these therapies will really be delivered in the top 100 cancer centers, where we believe we can build out a supply chain and commercial sales force. So just to conclude, we believe we have a highly differentiated targeted radiotherapy pipeline. Targeted radiotherapy has been an area of significant interest of late. There's been multiple multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. There's been new company formation. There's been strategic investments. And with completion of the phase 3 Sierra trial complete, we look forward to providing updates on the phase 3 trial, as well as advancing our Actimab A combination trials in the clinic and continuing to leverage the technology platform to advance our collaboration with Astellas, as well as create new programs and pipeline opportunities in the field of targeted radiotherapy in solid tumors, as well as with immunotherapy combinations. So thank you everyone for your time and attention this morning. I am happy to take any questions that the audience may have.
We are unfortunately out of time for questions. Steve O'Loughlin is the Chief Financial Officer of Actinium Pharmaceuticals. URL ticker up on the screen, Steve. Thank you so much.